Species in the environment undergo many different interactions with other species. We classify these interactions based on primarily who benefits in the interaction. So, species interactions include competition, predation, herbivory, parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. And we're going to go through these. But again, a shorthand for understanding them is just to think about two different species in that interaction and how that relationship benefits or harms the species. So when we think about competition between two species, that's really harmful to both. And so that's a negative interaction. Predation, herbivory, and parasitism are all feeding interactions where one species benefits and the other is harmed. So those are all 3 plus negative interactions. A mutualism is an interaction where both partners benefit. So it's a plus-plus relationship. And a commensalism is where one species is benefiting and one species is neither harmed nor benefited. And we'll go through and look at more examples of these in more detail. When we look at an ecosystem, the ecosystem is all the members of that ecosystem, the species that are living in it, are experiencing a complex mix of species interactions at any given time. So we might be looking at how a rabbit is experiencing predation, for example, but we always want to keep in mind that a rabbit is also experiencing competition and parasitism within its ecosystem. And so all of those interactions are impacting the rabbit and its population size, for example. So when we think about how species interactions impact populations, it's important to realize that negative interactions can be acting as possible density-dependent mortality factors. And the word that's also used for that is a limiting factor for that population. So that's keeping the population from growing bigger. So competition, predation, herbivory, and parasitism are all playing this role for populations. Whether a negative species interaction will have a really strong impact on a population or a small impact really depends on the species and the population. We'll see that there's the top-down versus bottom-up models of population control that affect this, and things like weather and other influences that can make competition, for example, be really strong in one year, and then in other years, competition might not have as big of an impact. Regardless, when organisms experience negative interactions, they generally have evolved mechanisms to lessen those impacts, right? So organisms have traits that have adapted to help reduce the impacts of competition. If competition was always having a really strong impact on them and they hadn't evolved any mechanisms to reduce that impact, then in all likelihood, that species might eventually go extinct. So when we're thinking about species interactions, we always want to be asking ourselves, how is this affecting the population and how are they adapted to minimize that effect? So we'll start out by taking a closer look at competition, and we'll see, again, these negative impacts and how organisms balance out those negative impacts. So first, I'll remind you that competition is a negative interaction. And then we'll talk about some terms for how we also can kind of break competition into multiple types. So there's intraspecific and interspecific competition. And specific here is referring to the term species. So intraspecies means between individuals of the same species. So for example, between two rabbits, whereas interspecific competition refers to competition between different species, so between a rabbit and a deer, for example. Exploitation competition is when organisms are competing with each other just because it's whoever gets to the food first. So it's just incidental, indirect competition. Interference competition is when individuals interact directly with one another by physical force or intimidation for the resource. So this is more like fighting for the food. And so something you maybe never thought about, but caterpillars, for example, actually try and intimidate each other if they're both on the same food source. So this caterpillar is trying to scare off this caterpillar and vice versa. Whereas in other cases, two caterpillars might just be happily munching on the same leaf, This would be exploitation competition. Whoever gets to the food the fastest is going to be the winner, rather than having a fight for food. So in nature, organisms are strongly influenced by competition. So they found, at least in a review of various field studies, so that means like looking in nature, they found that over half of the species surveyed showed competition, and that's probably an underestimate. In other studies where you look at two different species or pairs of species, you see that they are almost always experiencing competition between the pairs, so 90% of the time. If you look at more species, you see that they generally limit competition to one other species. So that's these two figures here. So the ant versus the beetle using this resource experience competition. But if you look at the broader resource supply, so in this case, grains, you have multiple organisms each feeding on that same grain resource supply, and the ant and the beetle are just part of the competitors for that resource supply. So they're experiencing direct competition with each other, but they're actually sharing the resource with two other species. So at a broader level, they're not experiencing competition. But again, the competition is generally present with at least one other species. Plants show an even higher degree of competition than animals. This makes sense because plants can't move. So if they're next to something, they're stuck fighting for that, whatever the soil resources with that organism or the light resources with that organism. Whereas animals do have some potential to move, right? So if there's a lot of beetles and the ants are having a hard time, they can go to a different location and try and access more food. We also see marine organisms tending to compete more than terrestrial ones, and this may be due to resource limitations there. So competition, not only is it very common in nature, it's also highly difficult for them. It has a lot of negative impacts. And so this has been demonstrated and defined as something called the competitive exclusion principle. What they showed was that direct competitors, complete competitors, that means they have the exact same requirements. If you put complete competitors together, they cannot coexist. One will be killed off or excluded. So that's where the term comes from. So competitive exclusion principle says that complete competitors will cause one of those organisms to be excluded or killed off. So the broad conclusion is that two species with exactly the same resource requirements cannot live together in the same place and use the same resources. That is, occupy the same niche in the environment. So a niche is a space and resource setting that organisms utilize. So this was carried out with protists, the paramecia, so 3 different species. These are them growing independently, but what they found was that the direct competitors, these two, had the exact same requirements, and so over time, this one was getting killed off. So notice how it's declining. And this shows that they're direct competitors, whereas these two were not complete competitors and so did not cause exclusion. So organisms are strongly impacted by competition, and so they have, through the course of evolution, have evolved ways to reduce competitive exclusion. And so the way that they do this is through something called resource partitioning. So to illustrate this, we have this example here. So there are 5 different birds. They're all related. They're warblers. And they all can coexist within spruce trees in New England. So they're living in the same tree. And so you might think, well, how could they possibly do that if they're all getting their resources from this tree? And what the researchers found was that each one of the bird species occupied a slightly different height and portion of the tree, as illustrated here. So, for example, the myrtle warbler is occupying the lower reaches and interior parts of the tree, whereas the Cape May warbler is utilizing a higher area of the tree. And so this allowed them to feed on a different range of insects. So by living in slightly different parts of the tree, they had a slightly different resource use and therefore are able to coexist. So again, this is called resource partitioning, a differentiation of niches, a differentiation of resource use in space and time that reduces competition. This reduction in competition is enough to allow them to successfully coexist. That is, no species goes extinct or is excluded. So what causes this resource partitioning? Well, of course, evolution, natural selection. So natural selection favors increased survival and reproduction. So traits that allow the birds to feed differently allowed them to survive and reproduce better. So morphological differences that reduce competition among competitors are favored by natural selection. So one study showed that there was, when they looked at size differences in feeding apparatus, so like beaks are a feeding apparatus, okay, that's like the technical term, and so a smaller beak versus a larger beak. If you had organisms living in the same geographic area and compared them to organisms living in different geographic areas, they found that the feeding apparatus size evolved to specialize on different food when the species were living in the same area. If they were living in different areas, then their feeding apparatus did not evolve to be different. So again, this is suggesting that the competitive pressure of organisms living in the same area favored the adaptation of having different feeding apparatus that allowed them to use different food sources. We've talked extensively about an example of this before, the Darwin finch example. So remember how the birds have different food sources on they've adapted traits differently for a different food source, right? So in the case of the Darwin finch example, it was about islands, right, which created a pressure. And that's slightly different here where we have competitors creating the pressure for different feeding apparatus, but it illustrates the same principle.